Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on a very early Saturday morning. I think you can see from what Dave just told you how important vitamin D is to each and every one of us. And so many people don't even know about it today, and they know, or they're very deficient in vitamin D. And the good news is it's about the easiest deficiency to correct. And not only is it easy, it's inexpensive, it's safe, and moreover, it's effective. Just briefly, this is what I'm going to cover this morning. First, just a little bit about the brain and vitamin D. Then we're going to look at vitamin D's mechanisms of action and how they correlate to the underlying physiological doses in an autism diagnostic label. And then I've got some interesting research for you. All the research that I'll be presenting this morning has been published in 2015. This is very recent information that has just come out. And then we'll just briefly touch on therapy considerations. And then finally, just a quick look at some of the vitamin D resources. Dave touched upon a few of them, but we'll just go over that. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. John J. McGrath. I was very fortunate to get to know Dr. McGrath last year at the 17th annual Vitamin D workshop, actually in downtown Chicago. He lives in Australia and works at the Queensland Brain Institute. I mentioned John here because he really is the pioneer when it comes to vitamin D and brain research. And you may note the year 2001 on the chart. That's about as far. Here we are in 2015, so it was really just 14 years ago that scientists really started looking at the correlation between vitamin D and autism. So it's only been 14 years, but in that time, they have come up with some very interesting information, very much describing that correlation. And John's first paper in this area was entitled Vitamin D, the Neglected Neurosteroid. And that kind of says it all, that there are lots of other neurosteroids, but vitamin D, for some reason, has sort of been swept aside. And he dusted that off, he and his colleagues, and began researching that. And he theorized that, quote unquote, vitamin D is a candidate risk for the neurodevelopment disorders. So I'm just going to take a quick look, a very basic look at vitamin D and the brain. When I got into vitamin D, and that was after being very, very ill at a relatively young age for apparently no reason, except I took it upon myself to find out why I couldn't get out of bed, why I couldn't do a load of laundry, why I couldn't drive the car a quarter of a mile, because my tank was empty. My vitamin D tank was empty, my endocrine tank was empty, lots of hormones were empty. And I did not know that until I started going to medical conferences and earning continuing medical education credits and finding out what was wrong with me. And I found out that vitamin D, my vitamin D was very low. It was 24.4 nanograms per milliliter. I live in sunny Las Vegas, and you could have knocked me over with a feather when I found out that my level was only 24. And I do not shun the sun. I'm not afraid of the sun. I never have been. So I went, okay, and then the more I studied, and by studied I mean traveling the country, attending medical conferences, really getting down into the weeds, doing my own research, and finding out that vitamin D is essential not only to our health, but to our quality of life. And so I asked myself in this process of learning, are the escalating incidences of autism connected to a growing prevalence of vitamin D deficiency. And as we've heard, I think many times here, that autism rates certainly are escalating. The CDC said that 1 out of every 68 Americans, have been affected now by autism. That rate just keeps going up and up, and the vitamin D deficiency keeps going up and up. So there's that direct correlation between the two. So very basically, every brain cell contains a vitamin D receptor. And each of these receptors control the genes that influence brain development. And the brain simply cannot develop properly without sufficient activated vitamin D. So as an example, I'm going to touch on serotonin. I think we all know the serotonin and how it can affect social behavior. Vitamin D regulates serotonin genes that are abnormally expressed in autism. We know serotonin is a neurotransmitter, but I'm not sure everyone knows that serotonin acts as a growth factor during early brain development. And vitamin D upregulates the central serotonin gene, and it downregulates the peripheral serotonin gene, that is outside the blood-brain barrier. However, in autism, what we have found that there are low concentrations of serotonin in the central brain blood levels and high concentrations in peripheral blood levels. And these numbers correlate to low vitamin D levels. When you see their 25 OHD blood levels, that's really the name of the blood test, and I'll get into that a bit when you ask to have your blood tested. And please ensure that you get the 25 hydroxy vitamin D level, and simply put, it's 25 OHD. And this study, by the way, this actually was published last June, right after last year's conference, and Rhonda Patrick and Bruce Ames are the authors of this study. They came out of Cal Berkeley, and Bruce Ames is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. So this was a pretty prestigious that they put this study together, and essentially they did identify 3 genes that are directly related to vitamin D and the brain level. And those 3, one was oxytocin, and the other 2 are serotonin, the central serotonin brain level, or gene, and the peripheral serotonin gene. So this was a very important find in trying to correlate vitamin D deficiency and autism. On this chart here, let's start on the right-hand column of this chart. What I have there are the underlying physiological issues in an autism diagnostic label, and then how they correlate to vitamin D's mechanisms of action. So the first one is genetic expression. Here we go. So I'm going to be going down this column. So the first one is genetic dysregulation. We've all heard this at the conference, how frequently genetic dysregulation comes up in an autism diagnostic label. And this includes gene mutations, strand breaks in the DNA. Well, what does vitamin D do? It regulates gene expression. You've probably heard the word a lot in the last couple days, and that word is epigenetics. And vitamin D is indeed epigenetic. The second point on the right-hand column is inflammation. So much inflammation with regard to autism. And inflammation has a number of causes. A couple are elevated prostaglandins, which are unsaturated fatty acids, and cytokines, the proteins. On the other hand, on the left-hand column, what does vitamin D do? It's anti-inflammatory. It reduces inflammation by inhibiting the synthesis of these substances. Then thirdly, back to the right-hand column, autoimmunity. Lots and lots of autoimmune conditions and people who have been diagnosed with autism. What does vitamin D do? It inhibits autoimmunity. And lastly, oxidative stress. Been hearing a lot about oxidative stress, in part caused by heavy metals and other toxins, lack of glutathione, which of course regulates the whole methylation process in our bodies. What does vitamin D do? It reduces oxidative stress by stimulating the production of glutathione. Now I'm going to get into these studies that I promised. I'm going to be talking about 4 studies, and they all are this year. They're just very, very recent. This one in particular is not even out on paper yet. It's been e-published. This has many authors, this particular study. It was published in the Journal of Nutrition Neuroscience. And Dave mentioned John J. Cannell, Dr. Cannell, who is the founder of the Vitamin D Council, and he was one of the authors of this paper. This was a case-controlled, cross-sectional analysis. They looked at 122 Egyptian children with ASD, and their ages were from 3 to 9. And they measured their vitamin D levels. There's that 25 OH vitamin D. Again, I keep mentioning that because there are other blood tests for vitamin D that are not nearly as effective. That's the one that you want to make sure that you get. That measures the vitamin D circulating in your bloodstream. And they compared these vitamin D levels to their CARS scores. Their finding was a significant inverse correlation between vitamin D levels and CARS scores. So high CARS scores, low vitamin D. High vitamin D, lower CARS scores. The authors concluded, and I quote, "Vitamin D is inexpensive, readily available, and safe." Here's another very recent study. In fact, it's been lauded as a groundbreaking study led by award-winning autism researcher Elizabeth Fernell, who is a doctor at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And this was just published in January in the prestigious journal Molecular Autism. She and her team selected 58 Swedish-born sibling pairs. One developed ASD and one did not. They measured the neonatal vitamin D levels. When I say neonatal, these babies, these newborns, were tested literally at birth. Very, very valuable information. They were dried spot blood tested, and those results were in their records, and later they were able to match the mother by having numbers assigned to the infant at the time. So they were able to look at that and see that the children who had developed autism had significantly lower vitamin D levels than their respective typically developing sibling. And this study is groundbreaking for another reason. It ruled out ASD-related lifestyle mechanisms, such as indoor living and dietary restrictions for low vitamin D. What this means is, of course, we're all trying to find the cause or causes of autism, and one theory has been, well, yes, the children who develop autism spectrum disorder are low in vitamin D. Yes, we know that. Well, that's because they have not been out in the sun, and when say they were diagnosed at 4, they've not been out in the sun, they've been covered in clothing, they play indoors, and they may have had dietary restrictions. Well, this study essentially rules that out. So that's saying right at birth, their vitamin D levels were low. This is children who later developed ASD. Very, very significant study. The next one, and I just have a few here, wrap up soon. This was published in pediatric case report. It's in the journal Pediatrics. It's case report conducted by Chinese and Dutch researchers on a 32-month-old Chinese boy. This boy was diagnosed with severe autism. His symptoms included self-injury, unresponsiveness to his name, he ran in circles, and he was incontinent. He was then treated with vitamin D3, the only real vitamin D, by the way, 150,000 international units a month that were given to him by injection, by an IM injection. And then he also was supplemented with 400 IU a day. And this treatment period was only 2 months. Okay, so keep in mind this was 2 months, very high doses in terms of the IM injection. And here are the findings of that study. Significant behavioral improvement, including he decreased his self-injurious behavior, he responded to his name, he asked his parents to hold him, and he became continent. And a little bit more of a look at this. What I did was look at his autism assessments, and then in parentheses in the left-hand column are what the score would be for typically developing children. So the first assessment was the Autism Behavioral Checklist. Before he was treated with vitamin D3, it was 80. Now you'll note typically developing is 53 or less. So he was an 80. After the 2-month therapy, he went down to a 39. Huge, huge improvement. And then as far as CARS, he was a 35 without vitamin D, and that was lowered to 28. So actually within the range for typically developing. And then CGI severity, typically developing is 1. His score was 6, and his score after D3 was 4. Not down to 1, but definitely an improvement. And of course, we have to look at his vitamin D levels. Dave was asking a number of you about your levels, and I think this is interesting. Before he was treated with vitamin D3, this little boy's reading was 12.5 nanograms per milliliter. And if any of you are from countries that do not use a nanogram per milliliter, that would be nanomoles per liter, and you simply multiply the nanogram figure by 2.5 to get to that. Then, after this 2-month therapy, his vitamin D level was 81.2. That's over a 6-time improvement in just 2 months. And this is the last study I'd like to mention, and this is kind of cool, and it's ongoing. So if you know of anyone who might be qualified for this study, I encourage you to contact the recruiter here. This is being sponsored by the University of California in San Francisco. They are looking for vitamin D deficient pediatric ASD patients from the ages of 3 through 8. And they're investigating vitamin D tolerability. Their treatment is a liquid D3 up to 10,000 IUs a day, which actually that's what I take a day, is 10,000 IU. Not real high, but high relatively to a number of perceptions. I think that's a good, healthy dose myself. So this is an ongoing clinical trial. I've got the number up there, you know, the NCT number, and you can get it from me afterwards if you're interested, and also the recruiting contact information. Felicia just contacted me the other day. We've been talking about this study, and they are still very much looking for recruits. She said, interestingly enough, they're having trouble getting recruits because either the vitamin D levels are too high, which is kind of interesting. What does too high mean with regard to this study? Over 30 nanograms per milliliter. And anyone getting into this study to be considered, they cannot be supplementing right now on D, nor can they be supplementing on vitamin A or cod liver oil, which has high concentrations of vitamin A and also D. Another interesting point about this study, if this study goes off well, it has a potential to get an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, a double-blind one, no less, which they're hard to come by. They're almost impossible to come by when we're talking about vitamin D and autism for a number of reasons, primarily financial and ethical. But anyhow, they would like to take this study and have a double-blind RCT to actually examine what are the behavioral improvements in terms of autism. Just wrapping up here, most of this information is from John J. Cannell, who just literally a few weeks ago published, I think it's a great book. It's called Autism Causes, Prevention and Treatment. And it was literally published last month in honor of Autism Awareness Month. And it's available on Amazon. I highly recommend it. But kind of his bottom line, and I totally agree with it, is if you wish to consider vitamin D therapy concerns for your child or someone who you know who has ASD, and this actually applies to everyone, get your blood tested. It's great that a lot of you volunteered your numbers because that means you know. And that's what's important, is what are your levels? Not as much how much you take a day. You need to have that baseline of what your levels are and then monitor that. So again, the test is 25 OHD. The goal is 80 nanograms per milliliter. Daily dose, anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 IUs a day of vitamin D3. And then John recommends, and again I concur, some safe, direct sun exposure, but absolutely no burning. Only enough to be out 20 minutes, probably no less. When we talk about direct sun exposure, there's so many factors that go into that. So don't really have time to get into all that here, but it's a good idea to get some sun exposure each day if you can. I know that's easier said than done from where we all live and weather, et cetera. And then magnesium, 125 to 500 milligrams a day. Zinc, 12 milligrams a day. Vitamin K2, 80 micrograms a day. And then to monitor your levels about every 3 months. And finally, certainly Dave touched on this quite a bit. He mentioned Grassroots Health, led by Carol Baggerly, a great lady who is going around primarily North America, having people get their blood tested. She's working with Dr. Carol Wagner in South Carolina on pregnancy findings with vitamin D. Just above that, Vitamin D Council, great website, great group. By the way, these are both nonprofit organizations. And I founded and run a vitamin D wellness. It's called Vitamin D Wellness in Facebook, and I encourage you to join us there. We don't talk about autism specifically there. Sometimes it comes up. I know there are a lot of autism Facebook groups, but if you have questions about vitamin D, hey, what about K2, what about magnesium, you're more than welcome to join us in the conversation. And then my website is smileandsuepubs.com. I have literally dozens of articles that I've written, including several on autism. So I encourage you to go there. And then right outside here, and I realize we've got to move on, I guess, fairly soon because someone else will be speaking here at 9 o'clock and they have to set up the room for that. But as you go out the doors, there's an exhibition area right over here. You'll see a big sign, a big poster of this cover. This is my book called Defend Your Life. It's won a Mom's Choice Award, which I'm very proud of for its family friendliness and creativity of getting the word out to families about how to improve their quality of life. So we'll take any questions now. Dave and I will. And then if we need to leave the room, just follow us just outside, and we'll be glad to talk to you. And I may have a couple of my books to give out. So thank you very much.